Hello, Professor Diesen. Welcome to the Nexus, and thank you for being here. My name is Mark. I just started in this space of, political commenting recently. I guess I started this podcast too, the Nexus, as well as writing a few articles. I believe I sent them to you via email, but let's focus on you. So, in case anyone is not familiar with Professor Diesen, he's a professor of political science at the Southeastern University in Norway, which I'm not sure how it is pronounced with the strike through O's.
Oh, that's the
It's okay, so it's like the German O umlaut, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, we have the same alphabet as English, but we have three more letters to fit our linguistics.
I see. So it's not the zero set as it will be in mathematics. So Professor Diesen has a specialty in Russian foreign policy, which I guess currently is a very hot topic. And perhaps more to the point, Glenn is a true scientist in the sense that he seeks and speaks the truth despite heavy costs to himself and reputation and whatnot. And for that, Glenn, I consider you a man of integrity for which, besides the huge brain, which I have the privilege of picking today, you have my deepest respect. And before we get started, let me also express my condolences about Gonzalo Lira. I know you guys had at least one podcast together. I don't know how close you were, but it's something that shouldn't happen. So I wanted to start off. So I know as an academic, we tend to focus more on the subject and not to go into this personal cliche, but since I've been following you for a while and never heard any of it, and extrapolating for myself, I think also your audience might appreciate it. So let me start with at least a few personal questions, if you wouldn't mind. I heard you had a Dutch citizenship and that you're now in Norway, right? So in form of a question, where did you live, where did you study, and what drove you to Norway? And finally, is Norway the ultimate place you want to settle down?
Oh, I haven't gotten that question before. No, well, I'm born in Norway, but I have a Dutch mother and her 10 brothers and sisters. They're all Dutch. So I was born with Dutch passport. I have a PhD from Amsterdam VU as well. But it's here I was born. I left Norway in 2000 and I came back 20 years later, but only part of that time was in Netherlands. I think about 14 years was Australia, a few years in Russia and Ireland, but no, it depends. I'm not sure if we'll stay here for a variety of reasons. But
I see. Yeah, same. So I'm in Switzerland, and the future of Europe seems a bit uncertain. So more about.
Sorry, just very quickly on that note, I emailed some former colleagues in Australia, and they just stay in touch, and they said there was a lot of European academics coming down now, so there's for some they get this feeling of a sinking ship. But
yeah. Well, we'll get more into that part later. So I have a few more questions just below about your publications, but just out of curiosity, do you consider yourself a contrarian? Do you like debating?
Yeah, of course. It's something I always encourage from my students as well, but not deliberately taking the position of the devil's advocate, but it's important to be able to put yourself in the shoes of the opponent. So that's why often I ask people to take their own position out and attempt to present the argument perhaps from the other side, because I think this is the heart of resolving any conflicts. You need to, if you can't understand the opponent, then you can't find a way of mitigating their security concerns, and then they will respond in a way which will undermine yours. So this used to be common sense, but in our day and age, you're an apologist, or you make excuses for you're legitimizing something if you're trying to explain different positions. So
Indeed. Yeah. Are you familiar with the term strongmanning?
Sorry,
Strong manning, steel manning.
steel manning?
Yeah, it's a term from, I guess, from philosophy. This is from,
Sorry, straw man.
no, strong. Like the opposite of a straw man is a strong man
Oh,
or
yeah.
a steel man. And so, I mean, it's what you said basically, which is you you summarize your counterpart's argument in the best, strongest possible terms, right? In your own words, but you give it the strongest possible formulation you can, and then you build upon that. And this is, yeah, it used to be not just that, but generally intellectual integrity used to be also common sense, you know? Like if I present 3 arguments that go towards A, then you can't just continue as if I had said nothing and continue your arguments. You have to first contend with my arguments and vice versa, right? You know, yeah, this is another topic.
Well, I think it's important that kind of explains some of my direction, because when I did my doctorate, I looked at the security architecture, or the security dilemma within the security architecture of Europe. So, you know, I wanted to look at how Russia challenges or threatens the security of the West, and how the West threatens the security of Russia. Now, I immediately, when I went to conferences, I noticed, you know, if I explain how the challenges Russia pose, you know, it's like, yeah, of course, everyone's clapping almost. But once you touch the topic of how NATO undermines Russian security, it's treated as taboo or something. You know, how can you possibly say that? That's a conspiracy theory, even though this is should be completely uncontroversial, that this is the main security concern they have, but yet you're not allowed to discuss it. Now, this is very problematic, because if you can't have proper analysis, you can't have proper policies. So all these people who suggest, no, Russia doesn't have any concern from Russia, they say this out, I assume they have good intentions, that they think it's very patriotic. But what you end up doing is you're creating policies, or contributing to policies, which are undermining our own security. Because if you keep ignoring what the Russians are saying are an existential threat, eventually they will feel they're pushed into a corner, and well, you're going to have what we have now, a war. And then we can of course pretend we had nothing to do with this, but you know, this is in my opinion nonsense.
Yeah. Just to finish up the personal part, because I'm itching to get to what you just mentioned. So as a professor, you teach and publish a lot. You're also a prolific author. And so firstly, what drove you to study political sciences in particular?
Well, I actually first did business degree. I had a master of business. I moved to Russia in the mid 2000s, and I thought it was fascinating, because it's like we lived in 2 different realities. And you know, well, we talk about the same events, you know, how the Cold War ended, what happened afterwards, but it's nothing in common. The narratives have completely nothing in common, and that kind of took me a bit by surprise, and that also created more of a interesting, not just in history, but the politics as well. Because I notice in the West we often say, how can the Russians believe this or this? But when I was there, you hear the same language. How can they possibly believe this and this in the West? But you know, these are clear facts. Like, well, yeah. So we speaking definitely past each other, and this is for me, this is interesting.
Okay. The next question is, how do you do this? Writing all this, the content creation, being a professor, grading papers. Do you not sleep?
Well, yeah, sometimes. No, it's well, if you have an interest in something, I think it
True, it drives you.
should drive you at least.
So the last one is a personal plea. Can you translate your books into audiobooks as well? Because I'm someone who likes to listen to them. There's apparently different learning types, but I love to listen to them while I'm on the way, while I'm doing sports. So that would be amazing if you could do that.
Yeah, I would have to hear with a publisher. I'm not sure how to go for it. I haven't had any of my books. I think 11 now, but none of them in audio. So of course, I've heard that about that before. So yeah, but I haven't moved anything though.
So let us now get into the mist of history and geopolitics then. I think it's useful to start with, maybe for some of those people because I'm still trying to build an audience, right? Maybe not everyone is following geopolitics as closely as I am, and certainly not as closely as you are. So would you maybe in maybe 1 or 2, 3 minutes summarize the current situation in the world, like this historic shift we're about to witness, this the moment in history we find ourselves immersed in?
Well, very briefly, I think we had a international system for the past 400 or 500 years based on a balance of power in which you have several big powers who balance each other. This whole thing was ended at the end of the Cold War because there was only one center of power, and we built a whole new world order after the Cold War based on American hegemony. And this was argued to be good for liberal values. Now, 30 years later, people can take different assessments, but either way, this era has come to an end. So now the world is moving in a multipolar direction. You have these huge powers from Russia, China, even friends of America, India, Turkey. They all want to be have the independent foreign policy, independent position, and they kind of reject the unipolar system, which the US has more or less imposed. And they're also rejecting how liberalism has been used as a way of making it indistinguishable from hegemony. That is, when we say rules-based order or liberal hegemony, well, what we're talking about is American dominance. And so I think this is where we're now. You see huge countries from China, Russia primarily, pulling the world to a multipolar direction, both primarily in the economics, but also militarily. And then you have the US and its NATO partners pulling very hard in the other direction, attempting to restore unipolarity. And this is, I think, the chaos. We don't have any common rules. We conflict in military, in information war, in the economics, obviously, and culturally across the board. So it's a very dangerous period in history as we our interests are not compatible. We don't have common rules anymore. And yes, we started discussing, we can't even sit in the same room and talk to each other. So it's it's a very dangerous era we're going into. And I wish there was more focus on the wider area, because when I turn on the news, all I see is there's a battle between democracy and authoritarianism, but this is not a good way of looking at the complexities of the world.
Yeah. So when you mentioned there's incompatible interests, I see what you mean and I agree, but I like doing this thing where you abstract far enough. So for example, we say we like democracy, but if we abstract far enough, we come to the conclusion that the driving values that push us towards wanting democracy in the end is wanting a good life, and then you can define some metrics for a good life, such as, I don't know, life expectancy, freedom of movement, freedom of possession, the rights of property and so on. And I think if we go down that pathway and define a good life, I think we'll all more or less agree from China over Russia to Europe. There might be some minor differences, of course, but I think if we go from there, and then we can build up what exactly are the metrics for democracy. For example, so I'm in Switzerland, but we have the neighbors to the north in Germany. I don't think a single German was ever asked whether they wanted to spend billions of their taxpayer money in Ukraine. So what are also if you consider the public satisfaction with their leader, I believe Scholz is trading below 20-something%, and Putin, according to 2 independent studies, like there was a Levada Institute, this pro-Western thing, and a Russian institute, he was around 70% after the start of the war. So what are the metrics exactly when people say democracy, right? I think it's useful to maybe push back on them by asking them to define what are the values that push it towards democracy, and what exactly is this thing democracy, which you mean anyways. Do you think that's a useful approach, or?
Yeah, it made me think about that we're kind of replaying the 19th century now, because what you're describing is very undemocratic liberalism, which we're undergoing. And it's not a new thing. We tend to think of liberalism and democracy as being 2 sides of the same coin, and it usually is when you're undergoing globalization, everything is opening up, and we're thriving. However, afterwards, when things are going bad, then they tend to turn on each other. So, for example, we saw it in the early to mid 1800s. People like John Stuart Mill, very liberal, pointing out that democracy is a good thing because we get to now challenge the Victorian English way of governing, which based on tradition. So they go hand in hand. But then after globalization begins to build up a lot of problems, the borders were opened, a lot of the free trade put many workers, farmers in very poor conditions. So then you saw around the 1870s, globalization going beginning to struggle. You had the economic crisis, all these issues. And then, of course, you had a lot of the same liberals now going against democracy because, they thought, well, the majority are now seeking refuge in the nation. This is where you have democracy. Globalization and democracy often they contradict each other, especially when your leaders have, loyalties to and interests beyond their own borders. So what you saw then was a lot of these liberals effectively saying, majority are not that clever. Well, they're threatening liberalism, and that's often what you see with these populist leaders, which have become quite popular. And we see the same now. Globalization, almost identical, has led to a lot of the same challenges, and now you see a lot of less liberal political figures emerging, also across the West, and they're very popular. And then, but they're not serving the liberal project, so it's now in conflict with democracy. Anyways, I think this is what we're seeing within a lot of Western countries. But of course, you're right. Schultz, who would have voted for his policies? And they're doing very poorly. And as a result, you have the rise of AfD. And what is the response? Should we ban the largest opposition here?
Democracy.
This is democracy, but it's not. Again, this for me, I think about John Stuart Mill. This is you're canceling democracy to preserve what they consider to be a liberal project. So, but no, I obviously look at a lot of the popular leaders. Biden's calling Putin a dictator. Putin sits in the approval rating in the 80s, and Biden's struggling to get into the 40s. It's quite. It is interesting. Of course, you can discuss democracy from other aspects. They don't have the same strength of institutions in Russia, but democratic institutions. But in my opinion, a lot of the foundations are going in the right direction in terms of solidarity. Not everything, of course, but in the U.S. we see the democratic deterioration. Once you view your main political opposition as an enemy, which will undermine the country, and you can't let them come to power, that's when democracy begins to decline. And look at the way the Americans are talking about each other. The Republicans, Democrats, they see each other as a threat to national security. Now, once this is the case, how can you have peaceful transfer of power? And the answer is you can't, which is why the past few elections now you see everyone's contesting it. Clinton said Trump cheated. He was a Russian agent. Then Trump says Biden cheated, and whoever wins next, they will also be accused of cheating. So there's no real, this is the red direction you go down. So it's this simple binary slogans of democracy versus authoritarianism. It's cheap propaganda. It's a way of saying good guys versus bad guys, good versus evil, which has always been at the core of political propaganda.
There was one more thing before my next question that I wanted to change to what you just said, which is that we in the West tend, at least in the public discourse, not to realize that different circumstances push different outcomes. What I mean by that is that if we consider, for example, Israel-Gaza, you cannot apply the same moral standards to an army that gets, 3.8 billion annually just from the US alone, and that has, it's a 300,000 men strong army, as you would impose on some 50,000 fighters at most, who are running around in tunnels in literally a closed off concentration camp. You cannot expect the same respect of human rights, so to speak, from these things. And the same goes, for example, for Russian institutions. You cannot expect a country that is under tremendous pressure from an international, overwhelming and oppressive community. You cannot expect them to have the same freedom, liberalism, and so on. The same holds, for example, for North Korea, Iran, and other nations. You have so much pressure from the outside, which just from game theoretical thoughts alone will lead to certain political outcomes on the inside, which are more, I guess, somewhat more totalitarian, right? Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, well, simple answer, yes. Well, um, well, people often treat the democracy and all, and respect for human rights as being, well, simply, setting up a voting box. You can topple a government, you put in one that loves democracy, and then everything is solved. But all the main scholars on, for example, democracy agrees on the same thing, which is well, I'm not sure all, but the consensus tends to be, you need solidarity, national solidarity, if you want democracy, because it reduces the extremes at the periphery, and it creates more or less a common path. If everyone in the country more or less have a common idea of what the country is, what it stands for, and the direction it's going, then the middle ground is already set, and within this you can have democracy, which is a lot of intellectual pluralism in which different ideas can be competed. The problem is when you end up with completely incompatible views. And this is, again, that's just back to my former point on the United States. Now, this is part of the problem, because what the Republicans and Democrats, for example, want is completely incompatible. And you see similarly in Europe. Well, who are we? If you ask the German government or the Hungarian, they will say very different. The Germans will say, who are we? We're, liberal ideas, blah, blah, blah. In the Hungary, they will say more conservative ideas. They will say, we're Christian nation state, blah, blah, blah. So the problem is when you have issues such as mass migration, the Germans will say, well, what would a good European do? And they would let everyone in because, human rights. While the Hungarians would say, well, then you diminish the Christian nation, the uniqueness of Europe, our unique culture, blah, blah, blah. So for them, it would be then a challenge. So in the past, we were liberal nation states, but what I see now is liberalism and nation states have liberalism has to some extent decoupled from the nation state. So now you see more and more polarization. In this area, you can't really have democracy begins to falter. And anyway, sorry, I think I went in a different direction.
It's okay, it's okay. It's meant to be a conversation. So I have another one that is general, and then I wanted to move more towards specifics like Ukraine and maybe media and Gaza. More Ukraine, I guess. So this is, what do you think would happen, with your historical bird's eye view, right? What do you think would happen if the West had its way today? If, say, Russia was defeated and so on? And I was thinking something towards maybe the century of humiliation for China or the 90s in Russia, but yeah, I'll let you answer that. What do you think will happen if the West had its way?
Well, I think this is part of the problem, because they keep saying, they obviously want to restore unipolarity. So the interests across the West are not exactly the same. The United States would, of course, both Europe and US would like to restore the unipolar order, there was one center of power, because this is seen as mitigating great power conflict, and also it will make liberal states effectively change the rules of the international system. So I think that would be the objective. Towards that end, the Americans are very open how to achieve it. It means you put a strategic defeat on the Russians, severely weaken them as an adversary, and that would also weaken the Chinese and restore U.S. hegemony. The European ones is almost the same. The Europeans want, of course, which is part of the purpose of the European Union, to have some equality with the US. So they would like to have this collective bargaining power. So you have, the unipolar order consisting of two blocks, the US and the EU. This is not going to happen, of course. I think Europe will slowly realize that the way the US asserts hegemony is by pitting the countries and regions against each other. So, China against India, is Iran against Saudis, Germans against Russians. This is, one side becomes dependent on America, the other one is weakened. So the Europeans, they tend to believe that as long as their allies, our interests are the same, I think they will wake up one day realizing that's not the case. Where was I going now? Sorry, it's early in the morning.
Yeah, no worries. I was thinking more about the people and the life quality, you know? Like you gave the gross political structure, but what do you think would happen on the everyday scale of European families, Russian families, or, I don't know, Iranian families?
Yeah, it's
You know, in that sense, it's more of a moral question, right? Just to maybe elucidate that perhaps if our side, Europe and the West wins, that we might actually be worse off.
yeah. Well, first of all, we keep saying we have to make sure Russia loses, that Ukraine wins. And a key problem there, of course, is we never defined what victory is, because the Ukrainians have, or at least Zelensky, and Zelensky said, they want to take back everything, including Crimea.
And
The
Moscow.
Americans, yeah, now they actually starting to seem like they're making other territorial claims as well. But this, of course, is very dangerous because we keep ignoring why Russia invaded to begin with. They see this as an existential threat. Now, my point is simple. That is, we would have a nuclear war before you would have NATO marching through Crimea, because they would never allow this. And also, in order to achieve this victory, we would have to send the weapons which will actually destroy all the Russian military with Western weapons. And of course, we keep crossing red lines all the time. But the main lesson here should be we will only cross these red lines for so long before a very vicious Russian retaliation comes. So my point is, do we really have we defined victory? And if we define it properly, that we're going to win a war against Russia in which they see an existential threat, this would most likely result in nuclear war. So is this a victory we would want to begin with? So the goal should have been to end the fighting altogether. No more Ukrainians or Russians should die. We should get some peace agreement in place, and the core of this, of course, would have been a pan-European security agreement in which there would be no more expansionism towards Russian borders. But of course, we can't do this. I think overall it's we would try this before in terms of what would be good for society. Look, in the early 1990s, all power in the world was concentrated in the West, primarily United States. Look at its main adversaries, China, Russia. Their main foreign policy was to integrate their economies as close with the US as possible, to get along with the US as much as possible, to have peace. Now, obviously, there are some problems. You couldn't really fully accommodate countries like Russia or China into a unipolar structure because, well, they're too big. It would stop being one center of power. Anyways, forward now 30 years, what do we have? We have, the US and the collective West severely weakened. You have, Russia and China seeking to decouple from West, well, at least the American economy, the American, technologies, industries, it's in transportation corridors, it's currencies, bank, everything. And of course, their main military strategy is now to collectively go against the United States and balance it. So it hasn't worked well. It wasn't stable, and this was kind of predictable. So the idea that we can kind of restore this era, it's for me, it's completely absurd. You would need a huge war and a conflict in the world. And that's just the external aspect of fighting these great powers. Look what it's taken from the United States. In the early 90s, they were, more or less very prosperous. Once you build an empire, what happens? You transfer a lot of resources from the core to the periphery. Look at the socio-economic problems they have in the US, how it has transformed itself into political instability. It's going to see similar issues here in Europe. So is this really the path we want to go down, or do we want to try to make a peace with a multipolar system?
Yeah.
And
So I was gonna say something, ask a different one, but I have this one, and I think this is a nice continuity to what you just said, which brings us back to those red lines and this whole unending quest for unipolar supremacy, basically, right? And I published recently my second article. It's about what I do is I set out a three-pronged scientific argument in the realm of psychology, where I talk about personality types, value types, and cultures of honor and their anthropologic origins. So psychrometry, which is basically how you can create a personality profile, right? Which is a fairly modern aspect of psychology, but it has great predictive power, right? I don't know if you're familiar with the Big Five model in psychology. It's one of the big models. And what I do is I propose this idea where you can create the psychometric profile, basically the personality type of someone. And if you link that and couple it to the model of realism, I know you've talked to John Mearsheimer, he's one of the biggest proponents of realism, right? And I propose this idea of psycho-realism, right? And the advantage of that model, so John Mearsheimer tends to say that realism predicts successfully 75% of all occurrences. Let's go with that number, why not? And I jokingly propose that psycho-realism might bump that up to 98%, because once you have this and you realize that the establishment in the US, perhaps since the 1960s, has been dominated by this neocon personality, neocon ideology, you can make sense and even predictions. It's basically what the Alexes use in the Duran podcast, right? They use the neocon psychology and make successful predictions and analysis of geopolitics. And so I basically formalized that into this model with not just neocons is the current thing, but the model applies to all personalities. And you can also use it to reverse engineer the personality behind a government and then make predictions based on that. What do you think of this approach, or does it sound too esoteric?
Well, no, it's an interesting one. I tend to fall in the category of neoclassical realism, so you mentioned Mearsheimer there. For your listeners, the main idea of realism would be that states, in order to maximize the security, have to act in accordance with the balance of power logic. That is, so for example, beginning of World War II, you have Germany being domineering in Europe. So then you have an incentive by the Soviets and Americans to cooperate. Once the Germans are gone, then you have two centers of power. They will then seek to balance each other. So effectively, the international distribution of power creates systemic pressures for how states have to behave. So this is realism, but neoclassical realism, it adds something to this, because neorealism is not a foreign policy theory. That is, it doesn't predict how states will behave. They only say how they should behave if they don't want to be punished. So what I argue is there's an intervening variable between the international distribution of power and the foreign policy, which is the people, the policymakers, and because they're not always rational in terms of responding, calculating their interests. They often have other issues. They have loyalties. They have ideologies. They have tied to think tanks or other things that might corrupt the decision making. And ideology, I think, is definitely a strong one, because if like I explained, if you see the U.S. empire effectively in terminal decline, you can't revive it. All interest would suggest they would try to find a compromise with other great powers. However, if you have a foreign policy elite which has for the past 30 years been told that the United States would or been promoting this idea that the United States would be a global hegemony in perpetuity, that this is the natural position, and also this is the only way you can have peace. If there is no power in the world that could possibly even dream of challenging U.S. primacy, if this is what you believe, these are the people who are put into power. What are you going to do? You will not respond to evidence in the same way anymore. So I think that we have the similar problems in Europe, of course. But I think that after the Cold War, you had a very strange marriage. You had these neocons which wanted to maintain U.S. hegemony at all costs, which meant very openly said, surrounding Russia with NATO, trying to weaken it from within. They said the same with China, and all rivals of America should be broken down. And then you have the liberals, the soft-hearted ones, who are saying, oh well, we can promote democracy and do humanitarian intervention. So we kind of have this ugly marriage almost of where we're both translates into the same thing. And this is what you see now in the rhetoric. If someone's suggests we need to transition into a multipolar system, the liberals will say, well, then liberal values won't be dominant anymore, and the neocons will say, well, now U.S. primacy won't survive. So there's too much objection to it. So I think definitely it's worth looking at the personalities of some of these people behind the wheel, because they appear to be steering the country in another way. And I would also look at Germany. Look what they're doing. None of this makes any sense. They've thrown away their entire industrial capacity, their main trading partners. The Americans say, listen, cut yourself off the Russians, cut yourself off the Chinese, and it's for democracy, and you still follow the ideology, even though that your country's strategic interest will be diminished and destroyed. It's for me, this is quite remarkable, and this can only be explained by neoclassical realism, where the decision maker has become delusional, I would say.
So I guess I was unfamiliar with the term neoclassical realism when I came up with the title Psycho-Realism. My idea was...
It can fit within, I think.
Yeah, my idea is you don't need so much to know the individual personalities of the people in power. You can make like a conglomerate, like an accumulated mixture of personalities, which makes up the government. And you can then psychoanalyze the government's personality, so to speak. It's a psychoanalyzing. Psychometrics is not psychoanalysis. It's an important distinction. But in any case, and I think that makes sense because this big five personality theory in psychology is very well elaborated, has great predictive power, has been reused, and I don't know of any more sophisticated theory to treat ideologies, right? Because ideology and personality are linked, so to speak. And so if you want to have predictive power, I think that makes a lot of sense. And one thing you can see, for example, is the whole idea of supremacy, the whole idea of going away from rationality, the whole idea of they hit us, so we have to respond immediately and in kind, like you see in Israel and you've seen throughout history, but not, for example, from Russia, right? Russia's plane was shot down by Turkey. They were not like, oh, we gotta respond immediately and in kind. And you can also see it in the way that the whole establishment, the whole neocon establishment, seems to view geopolitics like a big game. Like they say, we can't let Putin win. We gotta call his bluff. And all these words from poker and other games where or the grand chessboard by Brzezinski. And they really just see this like a big cinematized game, as if nuclear war, they would just shrug it off. It's just like a next level in their game. And I think that makes I don't know, it seems to me, obviously I'm biased since I wrote it, but it seems to me like it has a lot of predictive power that way, right?
Yeah, but I think this superiority complex is really something that should be explored to a greater extent, because keep in mind that since the age of exploration in the early 16th century, from the early 1500s, the world connected through, European maritime powers, or then Western, and then, you have this, dominating the world through military power, then more economic, especially then after the Industrial Revolution, you have imperialism going full scale. So effectively, the world has been under Western dominance to a large extent for 500 years. And if you look at the 19th century, for example, the way we portray ourselves with the rest of the world was always civilization versus barbarians. This is why, we have full sovereignty. They do not. And it's not just that we dominate them, that we have the right to do so, but it's a responsibility. We're doing something good because but we're helping them, because we believe in universalism. So there's one path to development. We are the champions, and we will help them along the way. So it's a responsibility of ours. It's a good thing. And of course, this has been replaced, from development, civilization. Now it's been, of course, recast as democracy and human rights. So it's not just that we have the right to intervene in other countries; it's our responsibility to do so. So and this is often how we also looked at the Russians. They were the barbarians in Europe. And they were the east to our west, so they've always been kind of our other. And you see this in the diplomacy we're doing. You mentioned the words we use. It's a very pedagogic teacher-student relationship. We have to punish them, or we can reward them. Everything is it's like an object. We're treating them as an object, so it's of security, and
It's
I think
deep-rooted.
this is deeply problematic. So now that suddenly, for the first time in 500 years, now you see the international system kind of falling under leadership of the Chinese economy. This is something quite remarkable, and also you're having this large, not just Russia, China, but you see other countries around the world seeking to make themselves less dependent on the West and envisioning effectively a post-Western world. This is a huge shock to the entire European system. That's why everyone's talking about this as if it's a conflict of world order, because
Yeah,
it is an issue of world order.
it is. So I have a few more specifics on Ukraine. Well, first of all, just a quick one. I don't, I don't know, I guess, spend too much time on the whole Israel-Gaza thing, because to me, it's, at least intellectually, it seems boring. It's a crystal clear genocidal intent, and it's just atrocities, one after the other being committed. And it's not so academically, intellectually interesting. Would you agree with that, or do you think I'm not doing it justice?
No, for me, well, it's it's made out to be more complex than it is.
Yeah.
I think the best way to understand it is to look at what Israel's options are, because they want to have they want to have a Jewish nation state. However, the problem is within the area they consider to be Greater Israel, you have the Jews are only about half the population. The other half are Palestinians and Arabs. So from my point of view, how are you going to solve this? Because either you can have two-state solution, one for Palestinians and one for the Jewish people, like Israel. Otherwise, but now, as Netanyahu keeps bragging, he has undermined and destroyed the two-state solution. So my point is, what are the options then if you don't have two-state? You can either have apartheid, which you have Palestinians living like they do in the West Bank under Israeli governance, which
Yeah,
they
the
have.
only democracy there, right?
Oh no, there's no democracy. They have one set of rules for
Yeah.
based on your ethnicity. So this is or religious background. So this is problematic. And then or alternatively, you can have ethnic cleansing, in which they want in Gaza push everyone into Egypt, which they also very clearly state. Yeah, but beyond this, if that doesn't work, you kill them. That is, you kill part or the entirety of the population, which is genocide. So if you have apartheid, ethnic cleansing, or genocide, and if people say no, that's not the case, well, I'm curious, what would be the other solution then? What are you
Yeah.
going to do with all these people? Because you can either have them live under oppressive laws, or you can push them out, or you can kill them. But there's no other option if Israel continues to undermine the two-state solution. So it's
We can move Israel to the US and replace some of the states there with an Israeli state.
yeah. Well, this is yeah, also not a great doable
Yeah.
solution. My but my point is that that has to be the point of departure. Like, what other solutions are there if we don't talk about two-state solution? And I think no one really discussing it. They often just want to rely on the catchphrases. Like, oh
Mm.
well, they have a right to defend themselves. Oh, Hamas are
Do you
terrorists.
condemn Hamas? Yeah,
Yeah, do you condemn Hamas? Yeah, but that doesn't get at the root of the problem,
not at
because
all.
like always in conflicts, our historical memory is very selective.
Hmm.
Like in Gaza, the conflict started on the 7th of October.
No.
Never mind the decades of horrible apartheid and oppression going on before, and same in Ukraine. For us, history began on the 24th of February in 2022.
Yeah, let's get into Ukraine. Let's transition. This is a nice transition, if you don't mind,
Yeah,
unless you had
that's
something.
a good segue, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I wanted to pick your brain as I guess someone very, not a historian per se, but it's clear that you know a lot of history. So in that light, I'm gonna put a controversial one to you. What merit does Ukraine have as a state?
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a kind of question which could get you canceled quickly. No, I think no, I think they have every well, according to international law, they have their own state. I think they should be their own state, and I think something that Russia obviously underestimated too was the national identity of Ukrainians, which had emerged since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I'm not one of those who would contest the Ukrainian statehood. That being said, if you ask what is the Ukrainian national identity, they actually saw a tweet by Zelensky's former advisor Arestovich. So this morning, in which he was kind of making that point as well. Like they don't have a common Ukrainian identity, or often in the because they have different views of their history with Russia, which is a long historical reason. But very briefly, how they have to find a way of explaining this close history they had with Russia, because they lived in the same states for centuries. And how are we going to explain this? And it becomes like this closeness becomes a two-edged sword. So in people in Eastern Ukraine, they tend to see, oh, well, we're brotherly people. So what is Ukraine then? Well, it's a country with two nations, cultures, you know, two languages, all of this. But then in Western Ukraine, you have people say, no, we are one ethnicity, one language, one culture. All the Russian influence here is a history of imperialism. So if you go in the West Ukraine, of course, doing a broad generalization, they will say nation building means to cleanse ourselves of this Russian relics of the past. We have to de-Russify. And in Eastern Ukraine, they say, well, our nation building means to develop this foundation of Ukrainian and Russians. And so they see each other as the greatest threat. Because if you're in Eastern Ukraine, you see these ethno-nationalists as being dangerous. They threaten what's core of being Ukrainian. If you go to Western Ukraine, you see the Eastern Ukrainians. They want to hold on to, the relics of the Russian imperialism. So they see each other as a threat. And so from this perspective, what's threatening nationhood for Ukraine has been the inability to harmonize these two positions. And they tried for me, the secret recipe would be to create your own
apartheid.
No. Well, no, that would destroy it, and that's why I think that the West contribute to destroy Ukraine. I know we like to pretend we saved it, but what Ukraine really needed was to have a distinctive national identity. So it's distinctive from Russian, but it's not anti-Russian. It can't be anti-Russian, because then, as you said, you will have apartheid, you will have de-Russification, which is also doesn't work. And I think that for a while it looked like this could work. The problem is, of course, you have external actors. On one hand, you have NATO countries, the other you have Russia. So obviously Russia wants to support the Eastern Ukrainians, which see this, brotherhood of peoples. And of course, NATO, which is trying to create a Europe without Russia, will support the Western Ukrainians, which is why we have this strange partnership where the Americans are effectively supporting, Azov and arming them, training them, using neo-Nazi symbols and all. And there's a reason behind this. This was in Western Ukraine, they've always been susceptible to a lot of these ideas because from them, you have the Ukrainian, purity, and then from their perspective, Kiev and Rus, the shared history they have with Russia, it's not a shared history. They are the sole successors of Kiev and Rus, which existed 1,000 years ago. So who are the Russians then? Because they also say, no, we're also the successors, but they can't have the same cradle of civilizational cradle, because then the Russians can contest their sovereignty. So they say, well, the Russians are just these, remnants of
Mongols,
of the Golden Horde. They're a bunch of Asiatic Mongols who stands at the gate of Europe, these barbarians, and suddenly, that kind of fits with a lot of the historical narratives we had in Western Europe too. And so they introduce a lot of these very hateful ideas, and that really poison in Eastern Ukraine as well. So again, it's not even my words. If you look in 2008, when the US and NATO that offered future membership to Ukraine, the American ambassador to Russia, who is now the director of the CIA, William Burns, he warned. He said, if we try to pull Ukraine into NATO, two things will happen. One, we'll probably have a civil war, and two, the Russians will intervene militarily, even though that's something they don't want to do. But they can't accept this, and I think it played out.
Don't forget that Merkel and I think Hollande vetoed it on the basis that they knew that Russia would consider it an act of war.
Yeah, well, that's a great irony. Now we're saying no, it wasn't provocative, but in 2008, Merkel later on said, the reason why we couldn't give the membership action plan. So they did promise future membership, but a membership action plan means you set the exact conditions and the timeline for joining. Merkel didn't want to do this because she said that would be interpreted as a declaration of war by Moscow. But now, of course, we say NATO expansion, nothing to do with the war.
Yeah.
Yet Merkel herself saying this will be a declaration of war. You're having, people like Burns saying the same. And again, it's not unique. If American administrations, all the way back to Clinton, you have so many of them confirming this, that this will put us on a path to conflict, if not war with Russia, if we ever try to absorb Ukraine. And now that we have war, all of this history is just brushed under the rug, and anyone who tries to revive it and talk about it will be accused of being a Russian agent, effectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, so what I meant, yeah, no, that's a good answer.
Sorry, that was a too long answer to.
No, it's great, it's great. I love the long answers. So we're nearing the hour, so let me prioritize the questions here. Well, let me ask you this one. This is a personal research thing. So I have this. So I wrote the article on the war in Ukraine, right? And in order to do this, obviously I had a bunch of notes, and one of them I put them together, concatenate them into like one document that I keep dragging around, collecting sources, dates, and facts. And I have this one little section where I'm trying to collect, I'm not going to say a bad word here, I'm trying to collect bad stuff on Russia, right? And I have a lot on the West. I have all the contracts that they voided. I have all the lies, like, I don't know, Ghost of Kiev, like, this is proof Iraq has WMD, right? Colin Powell. And a lot, right? Also specifically to Ukraine, I also have a very long list of lies, propaganda, the whole Bandera issue, and so on. And so on the West, you have like all the wars, the colonialism, neo-colonialism, the overt lies, the contracts breached, the covert operations, the regime changes, and so on. But I have very little on Russia. And I'm trying to do like this objective thing, right, where I'm trying to balance it. And obviously you can talk about their weak institutions, but then again, you have to also consider that they're under a lot of pressure, a lot of Russophobia, a lot of, so you cannot really, how should I put it? I can't really in good conscience say, look, you don't have the most open democracy, therefore you're bad. I have to say, look, you don't have the most open democracy, but I realize that there's not a lot of options for having an open democracy given the pressures you're under. And so what I have is like, for example, Harvest, a big company, allegedly seized a bunch of agricultural terrain in the occupied parts of Ukraine. And apparently it's held by a big Russian oligarch like Alexander Tkachev, I guess. And I have the little lie before the war that they're not going to invade Ukraine, the official Kremlin statement. But I don't have more. Do you have any? Give me some bad stuff on Russia.
Yeah, well, in terms of the oligarchs, I think, that's an interesting one, though, because when the oligarchs began to grow wealthy in the 90s and take over, enterprises, media, getting more government control, a lot of them were sending their money and setting up camp in, London and United States. So we're seen then as becoming, fear of being effectively made into a colony. And anyways, this is when Putin came to power, and he took out this. He got rid of the oligarchs who were. Well, he said anyone who intervenes in the political affairs of Russia will be held accountable for the crimes they did in the 90s. And every oligarch did a crime in the 90s. Now, of course, if you support Putin, then you are not interfering. So they just went after the oligarchs who were challenging him. So especially the ones who were useful for the West. So what's interesting is the West very much condemns that he went after the oligarchs, while the Russians would like him to also have gone after the pro-Kremlin oligarchs who supported him, not just one other side. So I see some. It would have been more chaotic, of course, but that's a reasonable one. I'm less critical in terms of the democratic development. I think a key challenge for Russia has always been its very different historical period. You know, they had from, it wasn't Kievan Rus, then you had the Muscovy, Russia, then you had Peter the Great trying to divorce himself from the own past. Then you have the Slavophiles, you have the Soviets. So, and anyways, every part of Russian history has been these segments where they completely detach from the former era. Now, the problem here is you create political divisions with different interpretation of what Russia is and the direction it should take. This has always prevented, peaceful transfer of power, which has been a real source of authoritarianism. I think now, as Russia goes down a more conservative path, which is defined as bringing together all these different fragmented part of its history, I think it has more prospects for democracy. So, for example, if the communists would take power today, they wouldn't be the old Soviet communists, or they wouldn't be the Bolsheviks. They put them in all under the same tent of Russian history. So, they wouldn't purge the churches anymore, for example. So there's a lot of positive going on there. In terms of Ukraine, what can you say? I think they put. Well, where would you start? Once they seized Crimea, I understand why they did it. Because they saw what was coming down the road. They would be kicked out, and America and NATO would replace them. Indeed, the Americans and British were modernizing the ports in other. Later on began modernizing ports in Ukraine after 2014 to fit British and American warships. So it's quite clear where they're going. But by taking Crimea, of course, they created a lot of instability within Ukraine and also it incentivized, I guess, a lot of the people in Donbass to rise up, which also led then to the Ukrainians, the new government in Ukraine using such brutality and killing all the people there. So I think in addition to the interference in Donbass, I mean, all of this is reaction to something else, but you can argue that they should have reacted in other way. And of course, you can argue taking back Crimea was in breach of the Budapest Memorandum of '94, in which but again, the West also broke this memorandum long time ago with sanctions and undermining Ukrainian sovereignty. And again, this is why the Russians effectively said, if the West is not going to respect this agreement, neither will we. So
it's always nuanced, isn't it? There's very little of actual bad behavior, as you can see from the West. Maybe it's just my opinion, but maybe I'm biased, but it does seem like the list of the West's crimes, so to speak, against morality, logic, and so on is this, and the Russian list is there, but it's not comparable.
Yeah, well, I think at some point both the West and Russia responds to each other.
Yeah.
But if you were to ask what the trigger would have been, what began all of this, I agree. It's definitely the West, because.
Yeah.
Well, if you see after the Cold War, what was Russia's main goal? They wanted to integrate with the West. They wanted to create an inclusive European security structure. And we actually agreed to this. We signed the Charter of Paris for New Europe in 1990. We signed the foundational documents of the OSCE in 1994, and all of these documents specified, we would end the dividing lines in Europe. We were going to have indivisible security, so one wouldn't expand on the expense of the other. We would have sovereign equality, but all of these things, when we began to expand NATO, went out the windows, because now we're moving dividing lines to the east. We're expanding our security at the expense of the Russians. So all along, the Russians were actually quite open on Ukraine. They said, listen, if you want to have Ukraine, for example, in NATO, that's all fine, but you also have to take us. If you don't take us as well, you're going to create a dividing line between Ukraine and Russia, and that will instigate civil war within Ukraine, and it's going to put NATO in conflict with Russia. Again, everything that happened, which Burns confirmed as well. But again, NATO is an institution to institutionalize hegemony. So they said no. So I do blame NATO as the main culprit for why we ended up in this conflict. But of course, it doesn't mean that the Russians have been angels all along.
Of course, yeah. It's just, yeah. So I would have a few more questions about the whole NATO part in Russia, but since we're at the hour, let me just finish up with one, I guess, last personal one, which is to you, like, when you do all this, like you do the publishing, you write books, you teach, you probably correct essays and so on, and you go on podcasts, and yeah, thank you for being here again, by the way. What is your favorite part of the day? Like, is there one book you're particularly proud of, or one publication, or one podcast, or do you maybe take some sort of remote pride in the maturity of your topic of study, that is, in the maturity of Russian foreign policy, for instance, like their diplomatic skills and so on?
Well, I guess my favorite part would be researching for books, which is why I prefer now books over articles, because you get to delve deeper into different topics. My favorite book, I guess, so far had been it's called Europe as the Western Peninsula of Greater Eurasia. It's about geoeconomic regions and the formation of a multipolar world. Also, I really liked, at least researching for my book on Russian conservatism. I don't know. I think I need different activities.
Brain food.
My majority are research, right? But it's good to get out of your chair to teach a little bit every now and then, and even grade papers. Otherwise, in the evenings, I usually have a variety of different TV interviews. Or it's also fun to do my own podcast, because I get to talk to different world leaders and experts, which I find to be quite interesting. So I don't know, just it's a nice job. You just get to do a bit of different things, I guess.
That's amazing. Yeah, I just started this, and I guess I'm loving it so far. And let's see where this goes. So
you should make it fun. If it's interesting and fun, at least you put in the work, you know.
It is, yeah. Well, thank you for Professor Diesen. Is there anything you'd like me to link? Maybe your a specific book or your podcast or anything else that I can put in the description?
Yeah, I have a new book coming out in 2 weeks. It's called The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order.
All right. Well, everyone, tune into that book. And thanks again, Professor Diesen. Have a nice evening, and hopefully see you again sometime.
Wow.